On December 11, 2008, a 70-year-old man walked out of his Manhattan apartment in handcuffs. $65 billion stopped existing that same morning. Not stolen, not lost. Most of it never existed in the first place. Here's the part almost every headline got wrong. That $65 billion wasn't cash that vanished. It was the total balance shown on decades of fake account statements, numbers Madoff simply made up. The actual money investors put in and lost was closer to $17 to $20 billion. Still one of the largest frauds in history, just not the number you've heard 1,000 times. For over a decade, thousands of investors stared at account statements showing steady, unshakable returns, month after month, year after year, through crashes and recoveries alike, and every single number on every single page was fiction. Here's what almost nobody tells you. This wasn't a con built on charisma. It was built on the one thing everyone assumed was impossible to fake: boredom. This is the real mechanism behind the largest Ponzi scheme in history, not the headlines, the math. Here's the strategy at the center of it. It was called a split strike conversion. Buy blue chip stocks, hedge with options, smooth out the gains and the losses so the ride feels boring and safe. It's a real strategy. Real fund managers use it. Here's the problem. Real versions of this strategy lose money sometimes. Madoff's never did. Not during the dot-com crash, not after 9/11, not once in over a decade. Any professional who looked closely should have seen it immediately, because returns that smooth in a strategy that volatile simply aren't possible in the real world. One person did the math. His name was Markopolos, and it took him less than 5 minutes to know it was fraud. It took regulators 9 years to listen. They never did. We'll come back to that. Here's what was actually happening with the money. It wasn't being invested at all. It was sitting in one account at one bank, waiting to be paid out to old investors, labeled as returns whenever they asked for it. That's the oldest trick in finance, running underneath one of the most respected names on Wall Street. Pay yesterday's investor with today's investor's money.
Here's why nobody suspected him for 20 years. Bernard Madoff wasn't an outsider. He started with money saved from lifeguarding and installing sprinklers, and built a firm that helped invent electronic trading. A firm so respected, he eventually became chairman of NASDAQ itself. Nobody was looking for a wolf. Everyone had already decided he was one of the shepherds. By the 1980s, he was quietly running a separate operation from a different floor of his own building. Different staff, different books. Almost nobody at his own firm ever saw it. That's where the crime actually lived, and that explains his reputation, but it doesn't explain how this survived 2 decades of scrutiny. 2 failures explain that, and this is the real point of this entire video. First, nobody who was paid to check ever checked. A fund managing tens of billions of dollars was audited by 3 people working out of a storefront office, fewer employees than a dry cleaner. Wealthy investors rarely gave him money directly. They went through middlemen, feeder funds, who collected fees for doing nothing but staying quiet. Every single link in that chain got paid to look away. Second, and this one should bother you more, the regulator. The SEC investigated Madoff multiple times across nearly 20 years. Markopolos handed them a written case for fraud. Every single time, they closed the file. Nobody ever picked up the phone and called an exchange to check if a single trade he claimed to make had actually happened. Not once, in 20 years of warnings. So here's the actual question this video is built around, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Was this one man's crime, or an entire system's failure that just happened to have one man's name on it? Because the honest answer is uncomfortable. Every single person in that chain, the auditor, the feeder funds, the regulator, had a reason not to look, and not one of them was Bernie Madoff.
Those failures held for almost 20 years. What finally broke it wasn't a whistleblower winning, and it wasn't a regulator waking up. It was something far more boring and far harder to fake: liquidity. The one thing every Ponzi scheme needs, and the one thing 2008 destroyed overnight. As markets crashed that year, panicked investors pulled money out of everything, including Madoff's fund. Instead of the slow trickle of withdrawals he'd covered for years with new deposits, he was suddenly facing $7 billion in redemption requests, almost overnight. The account holding the actual cash had nowhere close to that. In early December 2008, he told his sons the business was, in his words, one big lie, a Ponzi scheme, finished. They reported him to federal authorities the next day. He was arrested within 24 hours. 20 years of red flags, ignored by everyone whose job it was to catch them, and in the end, none of them stopped it. A market crash he didn't cause and couldn't survive, did.
The headlines afterward were almost all about him, his psychology, his lifestyle, the 150-year sentence. That's the story that got told. It's not the story that matters, if you actually want to understand how this happens again. The real lesson isn't the man, it's the mechanism. An audit system that never checked, a regulator that never verified, a fee structure that rewarded silence at every single step. Every one of those failures is still possible today, in different funds, under different names. The person changes every time. The mechanism barely does. That's what this channel actually exists to trace. Not just what happened, but the exact gap that let it happen, and why the story you were told almost never explains it. So here's the real question to leave you with. If the auditor, the feeder funds, and the regulator all had a reason to look away, who do you actually blame for this? If you want the real mechanics behind the next collapse, not the headline version, the actual one, subscribe, because that's exactly what's next.